It's 21 minutes to 9. We need to find new sources of energy to avoid burning the fossil fuels that cause climate change. But do we have the infrastructure to bring that power to where it's needed? In his speech this week, the Prime Minister promised to speed up planning for future electricity needs. There's been a lot of focus on how to bring energy created by offshore wind farms into the national grid, with campaigners opposed to new lines of 50-metre high pylons across the countryside. We can talk first of all to Professor Nick Butler, who's an energy economist specialising in the transition to a lower carbon world. Good morning.
Good morning.
So the question is obviously the need to generate cleaner forms of energy. But what's the state of the infrastructure when it comes to bringing that energy into the grid, into the big centres of population that need it?
We're very backward in terms of the infrastructure that's needed. I mean, to reach any of the targets, either Prime Minister's targets or the targets that were there before, is going to involve, for instance, something like a 50% increase in the use of electricity. The grid is just not ready for that. We need a revolution, as David Dimbleby was talking about in another context, of the way we use energy supply. And I think that that has not happened yet. And we won't get to any of these targets unless we increase that capacity.
And does that mean speeding up planning, do you think?
It does in some cases. It also means thinking about it in a more holistic way. The Royal Academy of Engineering have talked about a systems approach to this. I don't think it means destroying the protection of areas of real beauty or just imposing decisions on local communities. I think, for instance, there's a whole queue of projects of offshore wind, which we do need, waiting to come onto the grid. And there isn't the capacity to do that. I think we need to think more laterally. I think a lot of those connections could be made to single points offshore rather than point to point in each case. I think that would be very helpful. But we need to look at the whole system of how we use energy, not just producing more wind and solar and thinking that solves everything.
Let me bring in Rosie Pearson now from the Community Planning Alliance. Good morning, and do you accept the need for more infrastructure?
Good morning. Yes, we do. And we're very much in favour of all the offshore wind farms. What we're worried about is that if there are reforms to the planning system, they're done with indecent haste and that they miss the best solutions. And I completely agree with Nick Butler that one of those options is regards to offshore. What we're seeing at the moment is this kind of headlong rush with pylons being the main focus, which actually causes huge issues, not just to the habitats and countryside they cross and destroy, but to the businesses that are in those areas and the farmers that have to farm the land. But the unplanned approach we're seeing at the moment costs £6 billion more than doing it strategically with a holistic approach.
Although when we've discussed this with National Grid on the programme before, they said that the idea of putting the cables offshore rather than having pylons over the land would cost 4 times as much.
Well, National Grid aren't quoting the right cost. They're looking at something they've put together which actually is a straw man. It isn't fully offshore, and it certainly isn't an integrated grid. It actually adds additional infrastructure to the network, whereas we're saying, look, the power's produced offshore, keep it offshore for as long as possible and take it where it's needed, which from the North Sea in particular is down to London and the South. So what we want to see is a planning system that listens to communities, accepts proper alternatives, looks at the infrastructure that's properly needed and puts in place an offshore grid. And that's a cheaper, better and faster way of doing things.
Nick Butler, what are your thoughts on the costs of this?
My thoughts are you should look at the best examples. And I think the best example is what Hitachi is doing with the Dogger Bank offshore facilities. And that is not going to cost 4 times or whatever figure you quoted. I think it is perfectly possible to do this in a rational way without destroying the environment onshore.
Yeah, it's interesting because National Grid ESO said in 2020 that it was $6 billion cheaper to create an integrated grid. There was a study in 2015 which showed it was in no circumstance cheaper to continue as we are now. Another one in 2011 found cost savings of $3.5 billion. So consistently, the reports are showing it's better to integrate the infrastructure offshore. And yet National Grid is telling us, in fact, the CEO, John Pettigrew, is telling us it's our civic duty to accept pylons. So we're being told to accept the most damaging, most expensive approach.
Nick Butler, do you think that we're having a sufficiently mature debate about the kind of sacrifices that may need to be made in order to reach zero carbon targets?
No, and I don't think we are, and I don't think it's all about sacrifices. I think that there are some sacrifices we don't need to make, and I think, and maybe Rosie agrees with this, that the project at Sizewell to build another massive nuclear power station of a type that hasn't worked anywhere yet is a mistake and a waste of money. I think we should be spending that money on building infrastructure such as charging points for electric vehicles, which are another key essential part of the new system. This is a very big transformation from an infrastructure that is totally focused on using oil and gas to a system that is going to be much more focused on electricity.
Well, lots of arguments on both sides about Sizewell on the coast of Suffolk. Nick Butler, Rosie Pearson, thank you both.